The invitation was heavy, thick cream paper with edges dipped in real gold. But right there, on the bottom corner, was a smudge. A single, grey fingerprint of fireplace ash. Henry Thorn held it under the lamp in his quiet study, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He wasn't a man who trembled. He was the King's Lord Chancellor, the man who calmed crises before breakfast. But this piece of paper, this summoning to the Midwinter Gala, felt like a warrant. Outside his window, the first snow of December was falling on the palace courtyard. It was Friday, December 13th, 1842. The flakes floated down, soft and innocent, coating the grey stone in a perfect, clean white. Henry took a slow breath, but the air in his room tasted wrong. It tasted like the copper penny he'd sucked on as a boy when he was scared, metallic and cold. This was supposed to be the last normal moment, the last quiet hour before the biggest social event of the season. He walked to his dressing table, the old floorboard creaking its familiar song under his feet. The room smelled of lemon polish and the faint, sweet pipe smoke from last night. He picked up his signet ring from its velvet tray. It was solid silver, heavier than it looked, engraved with the Thorn family crest, a hawk holding a key. The key to the kingdom, people joked. He slid it onto his finger. It fit perfectly, as it had for 20 years. This was the ritual. The ring, then the jacket, then the calm mask of the Chancellor. But as he adjusted his crisp white collar in the mirror, he froze. There, on the starched linen, was the faintest trace of a scent. Jasmine. Sweet, light, and utterly out of place in his masculine, book-lined world. It was Queen Alara's perfume. He'd caught it earlier that afternoon, not in a secret meeting, but right out in the open. He'd been rushing to the library, a stack of tax reforms in his arms, and she'd been coming around the corner by the portrait hall. They'd almost collided. Her hand had brushed his arm to steady herself, and she'd looked up at him. Her green eyes held his for a second too long. "Do watch your step, Chancellor," she'd said, her voice a murmur. Then she was gone, leaving only that ghost of jasmine in the air. It was a brush that was not an accident. A message. A hairline fracture in his perfectly ordered world. Henry closed his eyes. He could lie to the king about border disputes. He could lie to the Treasury about missing funds. But he couldn't lie to himself in this quiet room. The feeling in his chest wasn't just fear. It was a wild, dangerous hope. A hope that had started 6 months ago, in the palace gardens, over a shared laugh about the king's grumpy pet pug. It was a hope built on whispered conversations in shadowy corridors and the electric feeling of standing just a little too close. He had buried that hope under mountains of paperwork and protocol. He had polished it into a smooth, secret stone he carried in his gut. But now, with that scent on his collar and that ash on the invitation, the stone felt like it was burning a hole right through him. He finished dressing, the black tails of his coat feeling like a weight on his shoulders. He checked his pocket watch, 6:55 p.m. The gala began at 7. He had to go down there. He had to smile, and bow, and make polite talk with ambassadors. He had to stand near the Queen and pretend she was just his sovereign, and not the person who made his world make sense. He walked to his study door, his hand pausing on the cold brass knob. From the grand hall below, he could hear the first notes of the string quartet tuning up. A squeak of a violin, the deep thrum of a cello. The sound of normal life going on. He opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The palace was alive with movement. Maids in rustling skirts carried trays of crystal glasses that chimed like tiny bells. Footmen in red livery marched past, their boots echoing on the marble. The air was warm, smelling of roasted meat from the kitchens and the waxy perfume of 1,000 beeswax candles. Henry moved through it all like a man in a dream. He nodded at Lord Pembroke, who was already arguing about port wine. He forced a smile for Lady Finch, who was complaining about the draft. His body was going through the motions, but his mind was back in that quiet study, looking at that ash smudge. Who had handled his invitation? It was delivered by a royal page, he knew that. A boy of about 14 with freckles and serious eyes. But the ash, that meant it had been somewhere near a fire. In a servant's hall? In someone's private chamber? That smudge was a clue he couldn't read, and it terrified him. He entered the grand hall. It was a breathtaking sight, just like it was every year. 3 giant chandeliers, each holding 100 candles, blazed with light, their reflections dancing in the polished floor. Great garlands of pine and holly draped the walls, filling the air with a fresh, wintry smell. The room was a sea of silk, velvet, and glittering jewels. He found his place near the throne dais, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then, the trumpet sounded. A bright, sharp fanfare that cut through all the chatter. Everyone turned. The great doors at the end of the hall swung open. There stood King Leopold, a big man with a ruddy face and a beard that was more grey than brown. He wore his crown and a heavy crimson cape, and he looked every bit the powerful ruler. And on his arm was Queen Alara. She was a vision in ice-blue silk. The dress shimmered as she walked, like she was moving through water. A simple diamond tiara held back her dark hair. She smiled, a calm, public smile, and waved gracefully to the room. But as she passed Henry, her eyes flicked to his for just an instant. In that flash, he didn't see a queen. He saw the same wild hope, the same terrifying fear that was churning inside him. Then she was gone, ascending the steps to her throne. The king began his welcome speech, his voice booming through the hall. Henry didn't hear a word. He was too busy remembering her scent on his collar. He was too busy feeling like the biggest fool and the luckiest man in the entire kingdom, all at once. This secret between them was a beautiful, fragile thing. But in a court full of whispers and watching eyes, a fragile thing could be shattered so easily. The king finished his speech to a round of applause. The musicians began a waltz. The crowd started to swirl and move. Henry stood rooted to the spot, watching the snow continue to fall silently past the tall, dark windows. He felt completely alone in the crowded, bright, noisy room. And then, it happened. A man, one of the king's personal guards, a man named Gregor with a scar across his chin, moved through the crowd. He walked right up to Henry. He didn't bow. He leaned in close, so close Henry could smell the onion on his breath. The man's voice was a low, rough whisper, meant only for Henry's ears. "Do you trust me, Chancellor?" The question hung in the air, ugly and cold. Before Henry could even think of an answer, before he could process the threat in those 5 words, the great gong sounded for the feast. It was a deep, bone-shaking sound that came from the hall's ancient bronze bell. The vibration didn't just hit Henry's ears. It traveled up through the marble floor, through the soles of his polished leather boots, and rattled his very teeth. It wasn't a call to dinner. It felt like a door slamming shut. It felt like the first blow of a war he didn't even know he was fighting. The guard, Gregor, merely gave a slow, knowing nod, and melted back into the crowd. Henry was left standing there, the cheerful music swirling around him, the smell of feast food in the air, and a cold certainty settling in his stomach. The last normal moment was over. It had ended not with a whisper, but with a deep, resonating gong that promised nothing would ever be the same. The deep sound of the gong was still vibrating in Henry's bones as the crowd began to move toward the banquet hall. Laughter and chatter rose like steam around him, but he stood frozen, a stone in a flowing river of silk and tailcoats. The guard's words, "Do you trust me, Chancellor?" echoed in his head, clashing with the cheerful music. His mouth went completely dry. He had to move. To stand still was to draw attention. So he let the current of people carry him along, his polished boots moving automatically over the familiar marble. He passed the giant portrait of King Leopold's grandfather, the old king's painted eyes seeming to follow him. The smell of roasted goose and honey-glazed carrots grew stronger, but instead of making him hungry, it turned his stomach. He entered the long, narrow banquet hall. A table stretched for what seemed like a mile, covered in a white linen cloth and groaning under the weight of silver platters and crystal decanters that caught the candlelight. He found his name card at the high table, right in the center of things. Of course, the Chancellor always had a seat of honor. Sitting down was a relief. At least he didn't have to worry about his legs giving way. He unfolded his napkin, the crisp linen feeling like sandpaper against his fingers. A servant immediately poured him a glass of deep red wine. He took a sip, but it tasted like vinegar. He had to get himself under control. He was Henry Thorn. He had negotiated peace treaties. He had stared down angry dukes. He could not fall apart because of a whispered question. The king stood at the head of the table, raising his glass for the traditional midwinter toast. To the kingdom, he boomed, his face flushed and happy. To prosperity and peace in the year to come. To the kingdom, the room roared back. 300 voices, 300 clinking glasses. Henry lifted his glass, the movement feeling stiff and robotic. He made his lips smile. He caught Queen Alara's eye from across the table. She gave him the smallest, quickest shake of her head, a warning, before turning to smile brilliantly at the ambassador beside her. That tiny gesture, that secret signal between them, should have been a comfort. Instead, it sent a fresh wave of cold sweat blooming right between his shoulder blades, soaking into the fine fabric of his shirt. His body was betraying him, reacting with pure animal fear even as his face held its calm mask. The feast began. Platters were passed. Henry took a slice of turkey, some potatoes, some braised cabbage. He moved the food around on his gold-rimmed plate with his fork, creating little trenches in the gravy. He nodded at conversations without hearing them. His jaw ached from holding his pleasant, neutral expression. He felt like he was watching the scene from very far away, through a thick pane of glass. He could see Lord Pembroke telling his same old story about a hunting dog. He could see Lady Finch complaining that her peas were undercooked. He could see the king laughing, a great big belly laugh that made his crown wobble. It was all so normal. And it was all a lie. Then he felt it. A light pressure against his palm as a servant leaned over to refill his water glass. When the servant moved away, something remained. A small, tightly folded square of paper. Henry's heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic, panic drumbeat. He casually closed his fingers over it, the paper crinkling silently in his fist. He waited for a count of 10, watching the bubbles rise in his newly poured water. Then, he pretended to dab his mouth with his napkin, slipping the note inside its folds. He needed to read it. And he couldn't do it here, under the gaze of 300 people and the king himself. He saw his chance when the third course was cleared. The musicians in the gallery started up a lively reel, and the king, who loved to dance, pushed back his chair. "Music," he declared. "Let's have some movement." As people began to shift, some heading for the dance floor, others clustering in groups to talk, Henry saw his opening. He stood, gave a small, polite bow to the empty air beside him as if excusing himself, and walked not toward the grand ballroom, but out a small, arched doorway hidden behind a tapestry of a hunting scene. He was in a servant's passage. The noise of the feast vanished, replaced by a thick, muffled silence. The air was cooler here, and smelled different, of stone, of old wood, and of the faint, clean scent of linen from the laundry rooms below. The walls were plain whitewashed stone, lit by simple oil lamps spaced far apart, casting long, dancing shadows. This was the palace's secret bloodstream, the roots the staff used to move unseen. Henry's own rapid footsteps echoed back at him as he walked, his dress shoes clicking on the flagstones. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. He turned a corner and saw a familiar door, the entrance to the palace stillroom, where herbs and flowers were dried for teas and medicines. It was always unlocked. He slipped inside, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft, final asterisk click star. Darkness. And then, as his eyes adjusted, soft grey light from a single, high window where the snow still fell outside. The room was lined with shelves holding hundreds of glass jars and ceramic pots. The air was dense with 100 smells: peppermint, lavender, rosemary, chamomile. It was usually a calming place. Now, it felt like a prison. His heart was still hammering, a painful thud in his throat. He unfolded the napkin, his fingers clumsy. The note was there. He smoothed it open against a wooden table dusted with dried petals. 2 words, in a handwriting he knew as well as his own. Asterisk the stillroom. Asterisk. She was already here. He hadn't even heard her arrive. He turned, and there she was, standing between the shelves of sage and thyme. Queen Alara, but not the queen from the banquet hall. The ice-blue silk dress seemed out of place here, among the drying herbs. She had no tiara. Her face was pale in the dim light, and her eyes were wide, not with love, but with a raw, unmistakable terror. "Henry," she breathed, his name a puff of vapor in the cold room. She didn't move toward him. "Alara, what is happening?" His own voice sounded strange to him, strained and tight. "A guard, Gregor, he asked me if I trusted him. The invitation had ash on it." "They know," she whispered, cutting him off. Her words were fast, tumbling out. "They know about the treason. They've found letters." A cold worse than any winter settled in Henry's stomach. Treason. The word hung in the fragrant air like poison. What treason? What letters? "Alara, I have written you no letters." Their affair had been built on looks, on touches, on moments. It had been a silent understanding. There was no evidence. "Not our letters," she said, and the way she said our broke his heart. She took a step closer, her silk gown rustling like a sigh. Asterisk his asterisk letters. The king's. She pulled a small, folded packet from a hidden pocket in her dress. It was tied with a plain black ribbon. She thrust it toward him. "He has been writing to Duke Arvid of the Northern Realm. Secretly. 4 months. He's promised him ports, land. He's promised to break our alliance with the Maritime Union. It will start a war, Henry. A war he thinks he can win." Henry took the packet. It felt heavy, far heavier than paper should be. He didn't need to open it to know it was real. The royal seal, a blob of red wax stamped with the signet ring of the Hawk and Key, asterisk is asterisk Hawk and Key, the design he advised on, was right there, broken. "How did you get these?" "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice desperate. "What matters is that his advisors, the ones like that weasel Lord Vane, they found out. They know there is a traitor with access to the king's private desk. They are looking for who it is." Henry's mind, trained for decades on statecraft and strategy, began to work, cutting through the fog of his personal fear. He saw the awful, brilliant shape of it. "And they think it's you." She nodded, a single, sharp movement. A tear escaped, tracing a silver line down her cheek. They need a scandal to bury the real one. And there it was. The shattering of his world. This wasn't about love discovered. This was about treason needing a disguise. Their whispered affair, the most precious and dangerous secret of his life, was nothing but a convenient decoy. A shiny, distracting piece of bait to dangle before the court, so no one would look at the rotten core beneath the throne. The brush in the hallway, the scent on his collar, it wasn't a message of love. It was a trail of breadcrumbs, leading not to a happy ending, but to a cliff. He looked at her, truly looked at her, in the grey light of the still room. The woman he thought he knew. The fear on her face was real. But was it fear asterisk for asterisk him, or fear asterisk of asterisk what he might do? The note in his hand, the king's treasonous letters, felt like they were burning his skin. The sound of footsteps, slow and measured, echoed in the passageway outside the door. One set. Then another. The king's guard. On their patrol. The footsteps grew louder, then paused right outside the still-room door. Henry and Alara stood perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. The only sound was the soft, relentless patter of snow against the high window. Henry could see the shadow of 2 men, cast by the lamplight in the hall, stretching under the crack of the door. He held the packet of letters behind his back, his hand clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. The moment stretched, thin and sharp as a razor. Then, the footsteps moved on, fading back down the corridor. The immediate danger had passed. But the greater danger was now in the room with them, sitting on the table between the jars of mint and lemon balm. Henry looked from the Queen's terrified face to the packet in his hand. The truth was no longer a secret between 2 hearts. It was a weapon, and it had just been placed, very carefully, into the hands of the one man who could use it to save the Queen, or to destroy the King. The cozy, bright world of the Midwinter Gala was gone. In this cold, quiet room full of dying herbs, a new and much more dangerous game had just begun. And Henry was no longer just a player. He had become the prize. The letters felt like a living thing in the hidden compartment of Henry's desk. For 3 days, he moved through the palace like a man made of smoke. He attended council meetings, his voice giving calm advice on grain tariffs and road repairs, while inside, his mind screamed. He signed documents with his steady chancellor's hand, but when he looked at the hawk and key seal, he saw only betrayal. Every meal tasted of dust. Every time he heard footsteps behind him in a corridor, his shoulders tensed, waiting for a hand to fall on his shoulder. He slept in short, ragged bursts, his dreams filled with the rustling sound of paper and the distant, echoing question, "Do you trust me, Chancellor?" He would wake in the deep blue hour before dawn, his nightshirt stuck to his skin with cold sweat, the scent of jasmine from his own pillow feeling like an accusation. It was on the morning of the 4th day, a Tuesday so grey and damp it seemed to leach the colour from the world, that he knew he had to make a choice. He could not keep carrying this fire in his pocket. He needed to understand. He needed to see the whole, ugly truth laid out, somewhere no one would think to look for him. So he went to the one place in the palace that was truly silent, the royal archives. It was a long, high-ceilinged room deep in the oldest part of the castle, far from the bustling kitchens and the gossiping drawing rooms. The air here was still and cool, smelling of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet smell of slow decay. Tall, narrow windows let in watery shafts of light that did little to push back the shadows clinging to the endless rows of shelves. Each shelf was packed tight with ledgers, scrolls, and treaty boxes, 100 years of the kingdom's secrets sleeping side by side. Henry's own footsteps were swallowed by the thick, faded carpets. He made his way to a familiar, heavy oak table at the very back, near a display case holding the original copy of the Great Accord, the treaty that had ended the border wars 60 years before. He placed his leather satchel on the table, the sound too loud in the silence. He didn't turn on the electric lamp. He worked by the pale grey light from the window, feeling like a ghost among ghosts. Slowly, carefully, he took out the packet of letters. The black ribbon felt slick against his fingers. He untied it. He spread the 5 pages out on the table, their crisp parchment looking alien against the worn, dark wood. He had read them a dozen times already. King Leopold's bold, sloping handwriting promised Duke Arvid military support. It discussed dates, supply routes, the weakening of eastern garrisons. It was a blueprint for a war that would fracture the continent. But today, he wasn't reading the words. He was looking for something else. A clue. A reason. Something to tell him what to do. His eyes moved from the treasonous words to the glass case beside him. Inside, under the glass, lay the Great Accord. The signatures of kings and queens from a past age were clear and bold, a promise of peace written in ink that had turned brown with time. He had devoted his life to upholding promises like that one. He looked at the glass, and for a moment, he didn't see the treaty. He saw a reflection. A man in a fine but rumpled coat, shadows like bruises under his eyes, his face pale and strained. This wasn't the powerful Lord Chancellor. This was a man haunted. A man who had let his heart overrule his duty. A man who had mistaken a secret for a bond. The reflection seemed to speak to him. Asterisk, you loved the idea of her, asterisk, it whispered. Asterisk, the danger, the secret, the break from your perfectly ordered life. You called it love, but was it just a thrill? And now, look at the cost. Asterisk, he saw himself not as a hero protecting a queen, but as a fool who had walked right into a trap. He had been so worried about saving Alara from scandal, he hadn't stopped to wonder if she needed saving, or if she was the one holding the net. The impossible choice stood before him, clear and horrible. Choice 1. Take the letters public. Expose the king's treason to the entire council, to the ambassadors, to the world. It would mean war for sure. The king would be deposed, maybe worse. The kingdom would be thrown into chaos, and Henry would be the man who lit the match. He would also be saving Alara from being framed. But would she thank him, or would she hate him for destroying her husband and her son's throne? Choice 2. Play the part they had written for him, Let the king's men discover the fake affair. He would be disgraced, banished, or imprisoned. Alara would be publicly shamed, but ultimately forgiven as a lonely queen led astray by a cunning advisor. The king's treason would remain hidden, the secret war would go ahead, and the kingdom would bleed for a lie. But at least the immediate scandal would be the kind the court could understand. A broken heart, not a broken crown. He put his head in his hands. His temples throbbed. He was a man who solved puzzles, who found the third option when everyone else saw only two. But here, in this silent archive, there was no third option. There was only ruin on one side, and a different, slower ruin on the other. He thought of Alara's face in the still room, the terror in her eyes, the single tear. He had believed that terror was for them, for their fragile secret. He had believed the tear was real. He had wrapped his own hope around her fear and called it a shared destiny. And then, like a crack of lightning in the grey room, he remembered something. A tiny detail his panicked mind had overlooked. In the still room, when the guard's shadows had stretched under the door, he had looked at Alara. She had been facing him, her back to the door. Her face was in shadow. But on the wall beside her, there was a small, polished copper pot for holding tools. It was dented and dulled, but it acted like a mirror. In its warped, curved surface, he had seen a reflection of her profile. At the time, he saw only her fear. But now, in the brutal clarity of the archive, he replayed that reflection. Her jaw had been set, not trembling, but tight, clenched, and her eyes, in that distorted copper mirror, hadn't been wide with panic. They had been narrowed, focused, watching him, watching for his reaction to the letters. The scent of jasmine, which had always seemed so sweet, now felt cloying and heavy in his memory. The brush in the hallway, the note passed at the feast, they weren't the desperate acts of a woman in love. They were the deliberate moves of a player on a chessboard. She had delivered the king's treason into his hands not for protection, but for a reason he couldn't yet see. She was maneuvering him. A cold, sick feeling, deeper than any fear he'd felt yet, spread through him. He had been so busy worrying about which king to betray, he never stopped to consider the queen. Just then, his elbow, resting on the table, knocked against his inkpot. It was a heavy crystal thing, a gift from some foreign delegate. It tipped over slowly, almost gracefully. The dark, black ink poured out across the oak tabletop, a spreading, hungry stain. It swallowed the edge of a ledger first, then crept toward the ancient, yellowed map of the kingdom that was always left out on that table for reference. Henry watched, numb, as the ink touched the edge of the parchment. It soaked in instantly, darkening the lines that marked the rivers, blurring the names of towns, swallowing the delicate drawings of forests along the northern border with Duke Arvid's realm. It was like watching the kingdom itself be erased, right before his eyes. He didn't move to stop it. He just watched the stain grow. It was a perfect picture of the choice before him. No matter what he did, something would be stained. Something would be lost. And then Henry realized the Queen's terror in the still room was a lie. It was a performance. A very, very good one. The real question wasn't about trust or love or even treason anymore. The real question, the one that chilled him to his core as he watched the ink destroy the map, was much simpler. What did she actually want him to do with these letters? He was not a knight in a story, saving a damsel. He was a piece on the board, and he had just finally looked up to see the hands of the players. One hand belonged to the king, moving toward war. The other, he now understood with a dawning, horrible clarity, belonged to the queen. And he was trapped right between them. The silence of the archives was no longer peaceful. It was the silence before the storm, and he was standing right in the middle of the field, with nowhere left to hide. The ink stain on the old map dried into a permanent, ugly blot, a dark continent of Henry's failure spreading across the northern forests. For a long time, he just sat there in the quiet archives, watching the last wet spot lose its shine. His mind, which had been a roaring storm of fear and doubt, went very, very quiet. The cold feeling in his stomach hardened into something else. Not courage, exactly. More like a decision. If he was a piece on a board, He would stop being a pawn. He would remember what he was good at. He was Henry Thorn, Lord Chancellor. His flaw was his devotion. His devotion to the crown, to order, to the careful, boring machinery of government that kept people safe and fed. For weeks, he had let his devotion to a person cloud that. No more. He would use the machinery itself as his weapon. He carefully blotted the dry letters, folded them, and tucked them back into their secret home. He cleaned up the ink as best he could, the black staining the rag and his fingertips. Then he left the archives, not as a haunted man, but as a man going to work. His first move was subtle. It was Wednesday, the day the master of the household submitted his weekly report on palace supplies. Henry requested the ledger a day early, citing a need to review candle wax expenditures before the budget meeting. As he pored over the columns of numbers in his sunlit office, he didn't care about the wax. He looked for other things. He saw an entry for the week of November 12th. 1. Copper stillroom pot, dented, sent for polishing. He allowed himself a thin, cold smile. So, the prop had been removed after the performance. He made a tiny, neat checkmark in the margin with his pencil. A fact, stored away. His second move was a rumour, planted like a seed in perfectly prepared soil. At Thursday afternoon's tea in the Rose Salon, a boring affair full of chatter about hemlines and horse breeds, he found himself standing next to old Lady Bramble, the biggest gossip in the kingdom. He spoke just loudly enough for her to hear as he admired a porcelain figurine. "Strange, how the northern messengers have been so frequent lately," he murmured, as if to himself. "Even in this snow. One wonders what news is so urgent it can't wait for spring." He then excused himself politely. By that evening, he knew, half the court would be whispering about the king's unusual correspondence. Their curiosity pointed in a useful direction, away from the queen and toward the throne itself. He became a master of misdirection. He accidentally left a file of boring timber trade agreements on his desk, but positioned it so the heading Northern Realm Import Quotas was clearly visible when Lord Vane, the king's most suspicious adviser, came to meet him. He saw Vane's sharp eyes dart to it, his thin mouth tightening. Henry apologized, sweeping the papers into a drawer. "Dreadfully dull stuff, my lord. Forgive the clutter." He used silence like a tool. In the king's private council, when the proposed maneuvers of troops along the eastern border were discussed, Henry did not object outright. He simply went very still. He let the silence after the king's pronouncement stretch for 1 second, 2 seconds too long, his face a mask of thoughtful concern. He watched the other councillors shift in their seats, their own doubts growing in the space his silence created. The king would then bluster, filling the quiet with loud justifications about preparedness. Henry would merely nod slowly, as if trying to be convinced. He made the king's plans feel unstable, just by not supporting them with his usual calm voice. Days turned into a week, then 2. The palace ticked on like a great clock, and Henry became one of its precise, quiet gears. He stopped looking for Alara in hallways. He stopped smelling jasmine in the air. When he passed her at court functions, he bowed with the exact, correct depth of a chancellor to his queen. No more, no less. His heart, which had felt so bruised and raw, now felt like a closed ledger, its account settled. The hope was gone. In its place was a cold, clean focus. The transformation was complete on the morning of the Winter Solstice Council, a major meeting where the kingdom's strategy for the coming year was formally outlined. The council chamber was imposing, a room meant for weighty decisions. A long, scarred oak table dominated the space, polished to a high shine by generations of anxious hands. Tall windows showed a world locked in white. A fire crackled in the giant hearth, but it didn't reach the chill at the room's center. The air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and the faint, sharp scent of men's cologne. Henry took his usual seat to the king's right. He placed his leather portfolio on the table with a soft thud. He had not brought the treasonous letters. He had brought something else. Inside his portfolio was a single sheet of paper, a shipping manifest from the port of Silverhaven. It had taken him 10 days and 3 discreet favors to acquire it. It listed the contents of a merchant vessel, the *North Star*, which had docked and been secretly offloaded under a royal waiver 2 months prior. The final entry was simple: 20 crates, iron contents, approved for royal smithy. The waiver signature was a scrawl, but the stamp was the royal seal. Iron was not for plowshares. It was for swords. The meeting droned on. Reports on wheat yields. Discussions on bridge repairs. Henry waited. He watched the king grow more confident, more expansive. Finally, the topic turned to foreign alliances. King Leopold leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "And regarding our friends in the Maritime Union," he said, his voice dripping with false regret, "their demands for exclusive port access are becoming burdensome. We must consider all our options for friendship and trade." It was the opening. The veiled reference to abandoning their oldest allies for Duke Arvid. Henry saw Lord Vane, sitting across the table, shoot a sharp, knowing look at the king. This was it. The plan was being nudged into the open. Henry took a slow, quiet breath. He felt a strange calm. This was no longer about his heart. It was about arithmetic, and strategy, and preventing a war. He opened his portfolio. He didn't pull out the manifest. Not yet. He looked down the table to where the Treasury Lord, a nervous man named Fennel with spectacles perched on his nose, was shuffling his own papers. "Before we speak of new friends," Henry said, and his voice was so calm, so clear, it cut through the room like the ring of a bell. Every head turned to him. He kept his eyes on Lord Fennel. "We must understand the cost. Lord Fennel, for the clarity of the council." He paused, letting the silence build, just as he'd practiced. The only sound was the spit of a log in the fireplace. "The ledgers, Minister, if you please." He wasn't asking for the Treasury ledgers. He was using a code he and Fennel had used for years when they needed to reference sensitive, off-record expenses. But to the King and Lord Vane, it would sound like Henry was calling for a routine financial report, something boring and procedural to slow down the King's momentum. Lord Fennel blinked, confused behind his glasses. The quarterlies, Chancellor." "The ones pertaining to special maritime imports," Henry said gently, his gaze steady. "Specifically, the waivers granted for priority unloading at Silver Haven in October. I believe the * North Star * was one. The tonnage fees seem irregular." He saw the blood drain from Lord Vane's face. The King's confident smile froze, then tightened into a grim line. They didn't know what Henry had, but he had just shown them he was looking at the money. And money left trails. Henry hadn't accused anyone of treason. He had merely asked for financial clarity, in front of the entire council. He had taken their secret war plans and reduced them to a question of accounting and tonnage fees. The hourglass on the speaker's podium hissed softly as the last grains of sand trickled down, marking the end of the time allotted for the alliance discussion. Time was up. Lord Fennel, flustered, began pulling a massive, leather-bound ledger from his stack. I'm sure it's all in order, Chancellor, but I can." Henry held up a hand, a small, graceful gesture. "After the recess will be fine, Lord Fennel. No need to disrupt the schedule." He had made his point. He had thrown a rock into the still pond of their conspiracy, and now he could watch the ripple spread. He closed his portfolio, his fingers resting on the hidden manifest inside. He had not played his final card. He had simply shown them he was holding a deck they didn't know was in the game. He finally lifted his eyes and met the King's gaze across the wide, polished oak. The King's eyes were no longer the eyes of a jovial ruler. They were hard, and bright, and full of a sudden, furious understanding. The friendly mask was gone. Henry held that gaze, his own expression one of polite, professional inquiry. No challenge. No fear. Just the steady, unblinking look of a man doing his job. The war was not on any border. It was here, in this warm, wood-panelled room. And Henry Thorn, the devoted Chancellor, had just fired the first, quiet, and perfectly legal shot. 2 years later, a different kind of snow was falling. It was a gentle, quiet snow in the valley of Hazelbrook, not the sharp, wind-whipped stuff that bit at the palace windows. It settled on the bare branches of the apple trees and dusted the roof of the stone cottage like a sprinkle of powdered sugar. It was March, a time when the palace would be muddy and grey, but here, the first green buds were daring to show themselves on the hawthorn hedge. Inside the cottage, the air was warm and smelled of bread. Real, brown bread, baking in the black iron stove. There was no scent of lemon polish, or beeswax candles, or nervous perfume. Henry placed another log on the fire, the wood cracking and sending up a shower of friendly orange sparks. His hands, once smooth and known only for holding pens and shaking diplomatic hands, were different now. They were marked with small nicks from splitting wood, and a callus had formed on his right palm from the handle of a plough. They were honest marks. He walked to the simple oak desk by the window, the one with the good view of the little barn and the snow-dusted field. On it sat a plain wooden box, made of cherrywood, sanded smooth by his own hands over many long evenings. He lifted the lid. Inside, on a scrap of folded grey wool, lay two things. The first was his signet ring. The silver was dull now, the hawk and key a little blurred from time and lack of polishing. It looked small and strangely unimportant, like a toy from a childhood he could barely remember. The second was a single sheet of parchment, folded neatly. It was one of the king's letters, not the most damning one, but the first one. The one that started, "My dear Arvid, the season turns, and our plans must turn with it." He had kept it. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A receipt for the life he traded. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He just looked at it, the old, fancy handwriting a stark contrast to the simple wool beneath it. Then he closed the box. The soft click of the latch was the only sound in the quiet room. That sound was the full stop at the end of a very long, very complicated sentence. From the kitchen area, he heard the cheerful clatter of a copper pot. He turned. A woman stood at the stove, her back to him, using a worn towel to lift the bread from the oven. Her name was Clara. Her hair was the color of wheat, and she wore it in a single, practical braid down her back. She wasn't a queen. She was the daughter of the village schoolmaster. She had clever eyes that missed nothing and a laugh that sounded like the brook out behind the barn. She turned, holding the steaming, golden loaf, her face flushed from the oven's heat. She smiled at him, a smile that reached her eyes and made little crinkles at the corners. It was a smile that held no secrets, no hidden warnings, no desperate plans. It was just a smile. "Supper's nearly ready," she said. "Are you finished with your thinking?" "I am," Henry said, and he found, to his own surprise, that he meant it. He placed the wooden box on the mantelpiece, next to a painted clay dove their neighbour's child had given them. It looked like it belonged there, just another part of a home, not a hidden treasure or a ticking bomb. Its weight was still there, but it was a weight he had chosen to carry. A marker of where he'd been, not a chain holding him back. He walked to the window. The scar on his left cheek, a thin, pale line that ran from his ear to his jaw, caught the soft firelight. He got it the night he left the palace for good. After the council meeting, things happened quickly. The king's fever was sudden. Lord Vane was quietly posted to a remote embassy. The official story was one of royal illness and a smooth transition. The young prince, a boy of 10, now sat on the throne with his mother, Queen Alara, as regent. The secret war never happened. The peace held. But on that final, chaotic night, as Henry was leaving his chambers for the last time with a single bag, a loyalist to the old king, a guardsman who believed the rumours of Henry's disloyalty to Leopold, had found him. There was a brief, ugly struggle in a dark corridor. A blade flashed. Henry's own skills, rusty from a life at a desk, had saved his life, but not before the knife's edge had kissed his face. The pain had been sharp and clean, and in a strange way, it had felt like a release. It was the palace's last mark on him, and it was one that healed. Clara came to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't say anything about the scar. She never had. She simply slipped her hand into his, her fingers rough from work but warm and sure. Together, they looked out at their land. At the 2 dairy cows, their breath-making clouds in the barn doorway. At the row of young apple trees they'd planted last spring, their branches holding little caps of snow. "The Morrisons said the first lambs might come tonight," Clara said, her voice quiet. "If the snow doesn't get too heavy." Henry nodded, squeezing her hand. He thought of the grand hall, of the 300 faces, of the unbearable weight of every word and every glance. He thought of the still room, thick with the scent of herbs and fear. He thought of the archives, and the spreading stain of the ink. That world was like a book he had read long ago. The story was familiar, but the feelings were distant, belonging to a different person. Here, the only weight was the honest weight of the seasons. The urgency of a coming lamb, the patience of a growing tree, the simple reward of bread you baked yourself. He was not a Lord Chancellor here. He was Henry, a man who fixed his own roof, who argued pleasantly with the blacksmith about the price of nails, who fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees and woke to the crow of his own rooster. He had traded a golden ring for a wooden box. He had traded a palace for a cottage. He had traded the feverish whispers of court for the comfortable silence of a shared meal. And as he stood there, with the smell of fresh bread filling the room and his wife's hand in his, watching the gentle snow cover the world in a soft, clean blanket, he knew, with a certainty deeper than any he had ever felt at the council table, that he had gotten the better end of the deal. The scar on his face didn't hurt anymore. It was just a part of him, a reminder that some wounds heal, and that what grows back in the healed place can be stronger, and quieter, and more real than anything that was there before. The fire crackled, the bread cooled on the table, and the snow continued to fall, covering yesterday's footprints, promising a fresh start with the dawn.